and wartime PD. John Brown is the authority on the coincidence of wartime and PD, going back to World War I and World War II. And John Brown has always traced very skillfully the budget rises when there's conflict. The budget falls when there's no conflict. And that is a profound mistake, the falling part, that is. And John's our expert on this. I want to encourage authors to comment. As I say, I have a threat here. I have a question, if you don't. Hella, Peter, John, Carol, you want my question first? I guess so. My question is, remember Paul Smith from the British Council? He stood right there. And he said about a year ago, the British Council, and this may be a mental game of some sort, but I take it seriously. The British Council, he said, I'm quoting, is not diplomacy, it is not public diplomacy, it is not soft power. He defined what the British Council does as international cultural relations. Now that implies that there's not a political agenda behind that. So my question to everybody is, two questions actually. Would we ever want such a thing? And if we did, who would pay for it? Hella Dale, thank you.
Well, I'm not going to say who would pay for it, but I just wanted to remind you, and I am a great admirer of the British Council indeed, that we need to have the British Empire before we could have a British Council. which we don't. This is an institution that is based on a commonality of all the countries that were on the Queen for one time or another. And I think it is an institution that we could all wish that we could afford, but I think we have to think in terms of a more contemporary context and let the Brits do what they do so well.
Thank you for deflating my wishes. No, I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we could do that? But that doesn't mean that political reality permits. Peter's got something. I see he's got some thoughts here. May I encourage you to comment?
Yeah, with the British Council, it seems to me that national branding, which has just been slightly disparaged, is a major part of their success. In that a lot of what they do and the affectation they do it with kind of reinforces an image, and I'm not sure that we want to do that or have an organization like that that's publicly funded. I guess the other thing is, in this administration and as we pass on, I think too often leading from behind in terms of putting forward a public diplomacy led to a diplomacy of domestic values, progressive values that I think most people in this room probably cherish. But overseas, frankly, in my travels, I got a lot of, well, you're preaching at us and you don't have our backs anymore. And I think that that's something we all have to wrestle with.
Can I hand this mic right back to you, Peter? Can you tell us more about why religion must be part of our public diplomacy program and why we're so shy of doing it?
Yeah, I think that religious, even in this society, I mean, my gosh, we're, by so many measures, we're a very, very religious society. And even when some authors bemoan the death of God and in the 60s and so forth, spiritualism was a huge movement. And I think a lot of inter-religious dialogue and energy can come from kind of inter-contemplative, inter-spiritual practice. But the fact is, in most of the societies we work, religious actors, leaders, communities, civil society, and the values that inform them are an important part of the equation. I think it's very important that we look primarily at religion as it's practiced in our, as we strategize or tacticize, if I can use a word. But at the same time, I think it's important that our area studies give us a basis in the history and evolution of the religious values in that society. They're important players, and to ignore them, whether we're promulgating policy or looking for partners the new structure at state highlights development, human rights practice, and what's the third one? Development, human rights. Senility is a horrible thing. Right. Democracy, human rights, democracy development, no. Human rights, economic development for sure, human rights, religious freedom for sure, and the third thing would be conflict resolution. There we go. Thank you.
So you passed the vetting process. Robert has a comment. I just want to say, Peter's chapter, the chapters are all great, but Peter's chapter reminds me that I was trained to think of separation of church and state, and that this becomes my American bias when I'm overseas, because other countries don't have that, and we need to look at it very directly and deal with it. Robert has a comment.
No, I just wanted to piggyback on Peter's talking about the role of religious actors, simply because there were a couple of quick examples that came to mind in which I was recently involved. And it's kind of part of this discussion, I think, of rethinking broad relationships with religious actors, science actors, actors in the arts, the audiovisual sector, and so on. Not always perhaps recognizing kind of what role these organizations play and kind of where they're positioned. You know, we had the Paris Climate Accords, and then the Pope came forth with his Laudato Si encyclical on climate change. And if we're thinking about the role of religion in broad-based international affairs, including its diplomatic dimensions, then one of the things I think would want to acknowledge is that Laudato Si has been kind of an important contribution to a public, sort of a framing of a public discourse around climate as a moral calling, which has added a dimension to that discussion, in addition to the kind of science and technocratic ways in which climate is typically discussed, you know, when we talk about carbon taxes and things of this nature. So that's one thing. The other thing is I've been involved in some work looking at the role of religion, religious actors and organizations in the question of climate, which is why I cited that example. And of course, if we're thinking about kind of the extent to which, even in a very instrumentalized way, we can promise to be effective in engaging other societies around critical issues of import to them and us, and let's just stick with climate for a second, were we not to take things like religion on board, that would mean things like we're not really paying attention to where it is that people think what's important or what matters in relationship to things like community adaptation and resilience in the response to climate. So communities, as societies now being asked to do things, both large and small, to respond to this kind of global, emerging global crisis and necessarily, you know, mode of cooperation, don't necessarily think of this as a technical problem to be solved. They think of it, sure, as a technical problem to be solved, but also as something that has implications for, you know, our religious and other ways of understanding the world. We were just in Delhi for a meeting in India, and of course, we were listening to a lot of colleagues talking about the challenges of dealing with questions of urban freshwater scarcity as a result of climate change. And one of those key challenges is the fact that rivers in India are typically considered sacred. So the Yanama or the Ganges or so forth. So the sanctity around these water systems is the first and primary issue that any kind of intervention needs to take on board if it wants to make sense of kind of steps forward in changing things like, you know, pollution levels in urban water, right?
And Peter mentions communities, which is the theme of Tom Friedman's new book. We'll talk about that shortly before we adjourn today. Peter wanted to ask, while Peter's commenting, if John is prepared to answer the question, why does history matter? Why do we need to know where we come from? If you're willing to comment on that, that would be great. Cynthia.
Just a warning that religion is not such a new thing. I mean, if you all remember the old strategic, not religion itself, but working on religion as one of the groups that one would want to know about and influence. If you all remember the old strategic influence analysis, one of the groups that we were supposed to look at and evaluate how influential they were and whether we needed to reach out to them was religious groups. And certainly in many countries when we were working on conflict resolution, we knew very well that it was the churches writ large that were very important. When we were working in Eastern Europe, we were concerned about discrimination or actual repression of religion. And certainly there's has been a continuing interest in anti-Semitism from the very beginning. So I think we have to be careful, all the points that Peter brings up as important for us to keep in mind so that we are even more effective. But let's not think that we invented all these things day after yesterday.
Well, it's a very good question. I could spend hours trying to answer it.
Please do.
Well, I think the one thing about looking at the past is that you recognize patterns. And certainly in the case of public diplomacy, there are patterns that repeat throughout time. Committee on Public Information, OWI, USIA. So you see these patterns, and that there's not that much new under the sun, really, because many of the issues that the Committee on Public Information during World War I faced are very contemporary today. I mean, the second thing I'd like to raise, I haven't heard the P word yet here, propaganda.
Well, I mentioned it, but please tell us more.
Well, it's a very, Walter Isaacson called the Declaration of Independence a work of propaganda. And so the whole issue of what is propaganda, where does it fit with public diplomacy and so on, is a very interesting problem. One of the things, and this is my final remark, regarding World War I and the Committee on Public Information, which, by the way, at its peak, was served by 150,000 people. Most of them volunteers, 150,000 people. And after the war, there was a reaction against the Committee on Public Information and George Creel. And after the war, there developed, I would say, in the United States, an anti-propaganda tradition, which came before opposition to communist and Nazi propaganda. And it's fascinating to read some of the repentant people who worked in the CPI, the Committee on Public Information, saying, well, we lied. We didn't tell the truth. And of course, George Creel himself, there was a term, and I'll finish with this, during World War I in the U.S., it was called creeling. Creeling, in other words, not telling the truth. And it was used in in Washington and in the Senate and so forth. Creeling was another word for lying. And so I'll stop with that.
Now, of course, historians never make value judgments, right, John? But maybe you have an opinion of propaganda. I don't know. I want impropaganda. Does Carol Balassa want to expand on your chapter on UNESCO and IPR issues? What I found it so intriguing in that chapter was, I remember when the American Film Institute was defending our right to export, but what you're talking about in your chapter is actually enabling other countries to do better marketing, which I think is very astute public diplomacy. Can you give us some comments on your own chapter?
Thank you. My chapter addresses, I make a case study about adoption of the UNESCO Cultural Diversity Convention and look closely at why the United States was defeated in a vote of 148-2, with only Israel joining with the United States in opposing adoption of the convention. And I look at the animosity that has been aroused in many foreign countries because of what's perceived as the domination of their motion picture sector by American film exports. And I use the convention as a case study to look at how the State Department, with the participation of other agencies, and USTR played an important role there because there were provisions in the convention that could have affected trade rules. And I look at just why the United States was so resoundingly defeated in that convention's vote. And in the course of my own negotiating experience at the WTO, where we tried to remove motion picture barriers to exports of foreign U.S. films, in many cases, countries would refuse to enter into discussion with us on those, on that possibility. And what I discovered is that much of the animosity came through the fact that foreign films find it so difficult to enter the U.S. market. And I take a close look at just why foreign films have difficulty in finding a place in U.S. motion picture theaters. And I came up with a suggestion that it would be a useful form and an unusual form of cultural diplomacy if, in fact, we were to engage foreign cultural delegations in just how they could enter the U.S. market. Traditionally, many foreign film producers are unable, they have very little understanding of how to market and distribute their films. And the Motion Picture Association is an expert in doing that, and so my suggestion is essentially, why not share some of that knowledge and use that as a tool of cultural diplomacy?
Brilliant, love it. And to make a bridge between Carol's comments and Robert, I want to quote from Robert's chapter very briefly. Transnational Applied Cultural Networks. He talks about cultural heritage conservation, documentary filmmaking, archival training. I call this not looking at the sun. If you look at the sun, which is make Muslims think that we really like them, that's a pretty awkward way to do it. Whereas if you, can I not use the word engage? If you have an activity, as our panelists have said, where the objectives are mutual. We have an objective, you have an objective, let's say conflict resolution, and addressing Peter's point, we don't, it's not effective, I have found, to go to Muslim communities and say, we like you. They don't believe us. Whereas, I'm thinking of the best program I ever saw, which was not mine, Mary Spears in Bamako, had women in Timbuktu illustrate in modern version the illuminated manuscripts of the Qurans that were in the archives at that time in Timbuktu, presenting it to the imams. They loved that. We did not talk to them about religion, but they knew why they were in the room, and that was really a winning formula. Robert had some.
No, I just wanted to piggyback on Carol's discussion of her own paper there, her own chapter, which is very good, and kind of reminds us of an interesting moment in international affairs where the U.S. found itself, oddly, at odds with people like countries like Canada and France and so forth around the issue of the global dominance of the U.S. film industry at a moment of the emergence of a global economy and the circulation of cultural goods and services, and the anxieties that was provoking in places largely elsewhere. In other words, not here in the U.S. so much, facing the kind of global juggernaut of distribution and promotion that is Hollywood, and which so successfully was able to place its films all over the world. And I just wanted to point to one little fact about that, which kind of underscores how the issue of culture goes to the heart of some of these broad international affairs issues. One of the problems in that period of negotiation, as it moved from the WTO to UNESCO and then was formulated as the Cultural Diversity Convention, 2005 and so forth, was that U.S. trade negotiators had a very different take on what was significant about this fight. And basically, U.S. trade negotiators were defending the notion of individual consumer choice, in the context of the global film industry and the distribution of goods and services. Whereas opponents to the kind of U.S.-based version of the intellectual property regime that they were wanting to defend were drawing a different relationship between film and national identity. national cultural identity, France, French film industry, Canada, so on, and seeing U.S. films as a kind of cultural invasion. Now, whether or not that's a fair critique or whether or not this is a mischaracterization of globalization really doesn't matter, because in the context of that particular trade struggle, it was a case of cultural goods and services at the center of very different cultural understandings of the meaning of the audiovisual sector as a global actor. And it's this kind of context that we so often, I think, gloss. And that's what makes that chapter interesting and some of these other chapters as well.
This brings us almost to conclusion. Any other thoughts, questions, answers? Sherry Muller, I thought you would never volunteer. Oh. No more broken feet. We have two.
Thank you, Adam. Sherry Mueller with the School of International Service at AU. I just wanted to ask you, you all are immersed in these chapters clearly and the ideas represented by the authors in the room and beyond. If you were advising the next Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs on what their priorities should be, what would you say?
Deafening silence. What a question. What a powerful question. Please, Debbie.
As much as a lot of us who are practitioners don't like to think about evaluation, we really have to learn how to measure better so that we can advocate more forcefully for continued and in fact expanded funding for our programs. And so one of the purposes of my chapter was to building on one of the sessions in the 2013 Public Diplomacy Council Forum, was to invite more participatory, inclusive design, monitoring, and evaluation of programs that end up being more credible because they reflect all the participants and stakeholders who are involved, especially as we turn more to public-private partnerships in cultural diplomacy, certainly, but in other realms of public diplomacy, science, art, all different venues. So when we, and it's happening, it has been happening in ECA, in the Department of State. There's a new evaluation unit that's been stood up. I don't know where that stands now with the political transition, but I'm hopeful that it and the fairly new congressional caucus on international study and exchange will have an opportunity to look at ways to inculcate an evaluation that's participatory and inclusive into public diplomacy work. Not just like 2% of the budget, but maybe 5%, so that we get the results. We get to showcase the results and point to them when we're talking about budgeting for the future. So that's something I would hope that a new Undersecretary would look at.
This is the holy grail of PD. We've never been able to monitor and evaluate. If somebody can find the formula, then we have a future. Did you have a comment?
I have a question. Okay, my name is Netra Halprin from Peace Films, and I'm not in this profession. I come from a nonviolent communication, nonviolent conflict resolution background. And so one of the initial things you said is the advancing the strategic and national interests. And I understand that you folks sound like you want to collaborate, you want to work with people, you want a peaceful, without climate change world. What if the administration, and I also ran for office, and I understand about how campaign finance works and how the effect of the military industry and how many billions of dollars they're making and how that affects administrations, whether it's been Democrat or Republican, and the decisions they're making, and maybe those decisions, like all the wars we're in, maybe those decisions don't jive with collaboration, a peaceful world, a world without climate change. What do you folks do when you're caught in that crosshairs?
Again, a question that merits a session on its own. We wish we had the answer to that. I would just say we are mortals. We don't. We're not. We would love to run the world, but we in this room don't do that. We want to continue. This is why I think it's urgent that everybody read the book and have an opinion about the question that's just been asked. What do we think is the most effective use of our talents and resources? We can't rest assured that those talents and resources will be used the way we want to, but we need to know what we want as a group, I think. I don't think we'll settle that finally today, but we certainly have to keep, we have to have an answer within a couple months, I would
Dan,
say.
could I wonder if I could just put the last two questions together. The first thing that I would say that R has to do, and thank heavens Bruce is there in I think an acting capacity, is that the our bureau has got to, and this might seem counterintuitive, has got to more closely integrate into the State Department so that they are a full participant in the discussions in every regional and functional bureau, so that public diplomacy is considered and respected. And so you need to have an R that's there and that is a full participant and that understands how the building works and is able to cross-culturally communicate what PD can and cannot and effectively do. And then one of the things then will be to explain how our values as well as our policies have got to be the administration's policies, but also the U.S. societal values. Both of them have to be furthered effectively and as not one or the other. And I think that this is the insight that all of us would call to mind, but I think very, very important is for the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs to become an effective member of the State Department senior team.
Can I just add to
And Bruce is very good at that. Yes, Robert, go ahead.
just real quick, and responding mostly to your injunction there, I was reminded of way back in the Hanna-Barbera days, you know, Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny and so on. And I think there was a great episode where Daffy Duck, in his epic defeat, appeals to, I think he says, pronoun trouble. You know, he's like, oh, pronoun trouble, I see. And he's referring to some screw-ups that destroyed his schemes. But I think that's a circuitous way of saying one of the things that we mean when we talk about public diplomacy is not just our State Department, the workings of the U.S. government. It's important to remind you that, or to remind us all that, you know, we're also talking about significant out-of-government activities. And much of the emphasis of a lot of the examples that people draw from in various chapters of the book are to put their finger on the role played by various nonprofit organizations, other, you know, science organizations, you know, religious organizations, and so on. During a time of transition from administration to administration, and in the context of the recent election, we've heard a lot of talk about what is to come. Some of that has raised the issue of the extent to which bureaucracies, government bureaucracies, are and aren't able to collaborate with, or willing to collaborate with, administration priorities going forward and how they might alter those. But setting all that aside entirely, another thing to emphasize is that we might be in a period where out-of-government activity has a renewed vitality and purpose and significance in the context of messaging in the best sense of dialogue and collaboration, where what we mean by U.S. interests can be more than just one account, right? And I think that might be particularly important now.
How fitting. This takes me to my last quote, which is from Tom Friedman in his new book, Thanks for Being Late. I want everybody to buy this book and then go to Politics and Prose and pick up Tom's book, page 451. That's all you have to read. That's the one that he quoted when he was at Carnegie a couple weeks ago. And he says this, coming right off of Robert's point. We will get to the best of these technologies only if we don't let them distract us from making these deep human connections, addressing these deep human longings, and inspiring these deep human energies. And whether we do that depends on all the stuff that you cannot download. And he gives examples: the high five from the coach, the praise from the mentor, the hug from a friend. With that, I thank the authors. I have door prizes for the authors. And join me in thanking the authors of this great book. This says, with the friendship of the people of the United States of America.